The garage didn't just smell like gasoline and old tires. It smelled like defiance. It smelled like a specific kind of American refusal to be told what to do, mixed with the salty, humid air of Daytona Beach in the late 1940s. If you walked past the building, you'd see a sign that wasn't trying to be humble. It didn't say Yunick's Auto Repair or Smokey's Service Station. It said, in bold, unapologetic letters, the best damn garage in town. And here's the thing, it wasn't marketing. It was a warning. It was a statement of fact that would haunt NASCAR officials, frustrate competitors, and absolutely bewilder automotive engineers for the next 40 years. Inside that garage was a man in a white uniform, usually wearing a cowboy hat, often holding a pipe, and almost always plotting something that was technically illegal but arguably brilliant. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the gray areas of automotive history where the legends live. If you're someone who loves stories about mechanical geniuses who treated rulebooks like rough drafts, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, we need to talk about Henry "Smokey" Yunick. But before we get to the flying cars and the hidden fuel tanks, you have to understand the world that created him. It's easy to look back at the 1950s and see black and white photos of smiling guys in crew cuts and assume it was a simpler, more innocent time. It wasn't. It was chaotic. It was raw. Specifically in the world of racing, it was the Wild West. You had guys coming back from World War II who had spent the last 4 years keeping B-17 bombers in the air with nothing but baling wire and chewing gum while people were actively shooting at them. They didn't care about factory specifications. They cared about survival and performance. Then you had the other half of the equation, the bootleggers. These were the guys who had spent the Prohibition era figuring out how to make a heavy Ford V8 outrun a federal agent's light coupe on a dirt road in the Appalachian Mountains. When you mix those two groups together on the hard-packed sand of Daytona, you didn't get a polite sporting event. You got a mechanical brawl. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but cheating is cheating, right? Well, here's what most people don't realize about early NASCAR. The rulebook in 1948 wasn't the phone book-sized legal document it is today. Today, if your rear spoiler is a millimeter too low, a laser scanner catches it and you're disqualified. Back then, the rulebook was a pamphlet. It was a gentleman's agreement in a sport filled with guys who weren't gentlemen. It said things like stock car, but it never really defined what stock meant. It was like telling a group of starving wolves that they could only eat some of the sheep. And into this gap stepped Smokey Yunick. Smokey wasn't just a mechanic, he was a philosopher of speed. His philosophy was simple, and he said it loud enough for everyone to hear. It's only cheating if you get caught. But don't mistake that for laziness. He didn't cheat because he couldn't build a fast engine legally. He cheated because he viewed the rulebook as an engineering challenge. He looked at a rule that said, you cannot do X, and his brain immediately translated that into, you can do anything that isn't strictly defined as X. It was a game of semantics played with steel and gasoline. Let's rewind a bit to where this mindset came from. Smokey dropped out of school at 16. He didn't have a degree from MIT. He had something better. He had the Army Air Corps. During the war, he was a pilot and a mechanic. When you're flying a B-17, the manual tells you the maximum RPM, the maximum manifold pressure, the limits of the airframe. But when you're over Europe and an engine is smoking and you need to get home, you learn that those limits are actually just suggestions. You learn that a machine can do a lot more than the engineer who designed it said it could, provided you have the guts to push it and the hands to hold it together. Smokey brought that get-it-home-at-all-cost mentality to racing. He realized early on that the factory engineers were conservative. They built cars to last for 100,000 miles of grocery getting. They left a massive amount of performance on the table because they were worried about warranty claims and fuel economy. Smokey wasn't worried about warranties. He was worried about winning. There's a statistic that blows my mind every time I think about it. In the modern era, wind tunnel testing costs thousands of dollars an hour. Teams spend millions optimizing airflow. Smokey did it by eye. He did it by painting a car, driving it fast, and seeing where the dust settled. He didn't have the data, but he had the intuition. And in a lot of ways, that made him more dangerous than the factory teams. The factory teams like Ford and Chrysler had budgets and committees. They had meetings about meetings. Smokey had a garage, a few loyal guys, and a complete lack of respect for authority. Here's the thing about the best damn garage in town. It became a magnet. If you were a racer in the 50s and you wanted to go fast, you knew where to go. But you also knew you were making a deal with the devil. Smokey was difficult. He was abrasive. He would throw you out of his shop if you asked a stupid question. He once famously told a driver, "You drive the car, I'll build it. If you want to build it, get out." He viewed the driver as a necessary evil, a faulty biological component in his perfect mechanical system. If he could have figured out a way to race the car without a person inside it, he would have done it in a heartbeat. The atmosphere in that garage was intense. Imagine a place where the lights are on 20 hours a day, where there are no blueprints, just sketches on the back of cigarette packs. Smokey would walk around, inspecting work, and if something wasn't right, not rulebook right, but Smokey right, he'd smash it with a hammer so it couldn't be used. He demanded perfection in the execution of his deception, because that was the key. If you're gonna break the rules, the work has to be flawless. You can't leave a jagged edge or a loose bolt. The cheat has to look more factory than the factory parts. It has to be invisible. This is where it gets really interesting. Smokey didn't just tweak engines, he reimagined the physics of the car. He looked at a 1966 Chevelle and didn't see a car, he saw a collection of aerodynamic flaws and weight distribution errors. The rulebook said the car had to be a Chevelle. It had to have the bumper of a Chevelle, the roofline of a Chevelle. But did it have to be a Chevelle? In Smokey's mind, no. It just had to look like one from 10 feet away while an inspector was hung over on a Sunday morning. That distinction is where the legend begins. Most people think of cheating as adding something, adding nitrous, adding a bigger engine. Smokey understood that real innovation was often about taking things away or moving them where they weren't supposed to be. He treated the car as a fluid object. Why does the fuel tank have to be here? Why does the exhaust have to exit there? Why does the driver have to sit exactly in this spot? If the rulebook didn't explicitly say, the driver must sit at X coordinates, Smokey moved the driver, he moved the engine, he moved the suspension points. He was playing 4D chess while NASCAR was playing checkers. The tension between Smokey and NASCAR wasn't just a rivalry, it was an arms race. Every time Smokey showed up at a track, the inspectors would sweat. They knew he had done something. They knew it in their gut. The car sat a little too low, or it sounded a little too crisp, or it just looked wrong in a way they couldn't articulate. They would measure the wheelbase. Perfect. They would measure the engine displacement. Perfect. They would check the carburetor. Legal. But then the car would go out on the track and pull away from the pack like the other cars were parked. And Bill France Sr., the founder of NASCAR, would be up in the tower, watching this legal car destroy his field of competitors, knowing that Smokey had outsmarted them again. It drove them crazy. But they couldn't ban him, not really, because the fans loved it. They loved the best damn garage in town. They loved the idea that one guy with a wrench and a bad attitude could beat the million-dollar corporations. Smokey was the people's champion, even if he was a nightmare for the officials. So let's talk about the time Smokey shrank a car. I don't mean he put it in the wash and it came out tight. I mean he fundamentally altered the reality of what a Chevrolet Chevelle was supposed to be. In 1966, the rulebook was very specific about certain things. It said the engine had to be this size, the wheelbase had to be that length, and the body had to be a stock production body. Now, you might be thinking, how do you fake a whole car body? Well, Smokey looked at the Chevelle and realized that it was a brick. It was aerodynamic garbage. It was big, it was boxy, and it pushed way too much air. At 200 miles per hour, air isn't a gas anymore. It's a wall. Every square inch of frontal area is costing you horsepower. Here's what most people don't realize about drag. It increases with the square of your speed. If you double your speed, you don't double the drag, you quadruple it. Smokey knew this, so he decided to build his own Chevelle. He didn't buy panels from GM, he hand-formed them. And as he formed them, he made everything slightly smaller. He tucked the bumpers in, he smoothed the roofline, he narrowed the body. When he was done, the car was perfectly proportioned. It looked exactly like a 1966 Chevelle, except it was roughly 7/8 the size of the real thing. It was a scale model that you could drive. When he rolled it into inspection at Daytona, the officials were confused. They looked at it and something felt off. It was like looking at a celebrity in real life and realizing they're shorter than they look on TV. They measured the wheelbase, it was perfect. They measured the track width, perfect. They measured the roof height, perfect. But they didn't measure the car relative to itself. They didn't have a template that covered the entire vehicle at once. They checked point A to point B, and Smokey had made sure point A and point B were legal. It was everything between point A and point B that he had manipulated. The car was slippery. It cut through the air while the other legal cars were busy punching a hole in the atmosphere. He had effectively given himself free horsepower just by deleting metal. But the 7/8 Chevelle wasn't even his most brazen moment that week. That title belongs to the fuel line incident, which might be the greatest mic drop in the history of motorsports. See, NASCAR knew Smokey played games with fuel. They had strict rules about fuel tank size because they didn't want anyone having an unfair range advantage. If you can stay out on the track for 5 laps longer than the other guy, you save a pit stop. Over 500 miles, that's the race. The inspectors were all over his car. They removed the fuel tank to measure its volume, literally pouring water into it to see exactly how much it held. They were triumphant. They found 9 different violations on the car. They were smug. They told Smokey, "This car is illegal. Get it out of here. Fix it or you don't race." They expected him to tow it away. Instead, Smokey climbed into the driver's seat. Remember, the fuel tank is currently sitting on the ground next to the car. The inspectors are watching, confused. Smokey turns the key, the engine fires. He revs it, looks the head inspector dead in the eye, puts it in gear, and drives back to its garage without a gas tank. How? This is where it gets really interesting. Smokey had realized that the rulebook specified the size of the tank, but it said absolutely nothing about the size of the fuel line. The fuel line is just the plumbing, right? It's supposed to be a 1/4-inch tube. Smokey had installed a fuel line that was 2 inches in diameter and coiled like a snake through the interior of the car. It was basically a garden hose on steroids. That plumbing held nearly 2 gallons of gasoline. That's enough to drive from the inspection bay to his garage, and more importantly, it was enough to give him those few extra laps during the race. It was technically a fuel line. It just happened to be a fuel line that held more gas than a lawnmower. That moment defined the era. It was Smokey saying, "I am smarter than you. I am reading the rules more closely than you, and I will embarrass you if you try to stop me." Look, stories like that are fun, but they overshadow the fact that Smokey was actually a brilliant physicist. He wasn't just a trickster. Take the cool air intake. Today, every kid with a Honda Civic knows that a cold air intake adds power. Cold air is denser. Denser air has more oxygen molecules per cubic inch. More oxygen means you can burn more fuel. More fuel burned means a bigger bang in the cylinder. Bigger bang equals more horsepower. Simple thermodynamics. In the 1960s, nobody was really thinking about air temperature. They were just sucking hot air right off the top of the radiator. Smokey looked at that and thought, why are we feeding the engine garbage air? He designed an intake system that routed air from high-pressure areas away from the engine heat. But he didn't stop there. He routed the intake tubing past the air conditioning system. Now, race cars don't have AC for the driver. That's dead weight. But Smokey wasn't cooling the driver, he was supercooling the intake charge. He was essentially building a primitive intercooler before intercoolers were standard on race cars. Was it illegal? The rulebook didn't say, "Thou shalt not refrigerate the air." It just hadn't occurred to anyone else to try it. When NASCAR figured it out, they didn't just ban it, they studied it. A lot of modern engine management systems use principles that Smokey was hacking together in his garage 60 years ago. That's the difference between a cheater and an innovator. A cheater breaks the rules to get back to even. An innovator breaks the rules to push the entire sport forward. Then there was the basketball. This is one of those relatable analogies that makes you appreciate his genius. You know how a basketball works. It's an inflatable bladder inside a skin. Smokey looked at his fuel tank again. The inspectors were getting smarter. They were measuring everything. So Smokey put an inflatable bladder, basically a basketball, inside his fuel tank. When he went through inspection, the ball was deflated and flat against the bottom. The tank measured the correct standard volume. It held the legal amount of fuel. But during the race, he had a system to inflate that bladder. Wait, scratch that. I got it backwards. That's the expected cheat. Smokey did the reverse. He would have the bladder inflated during inspection to take up space. No, that doesn't make sense. Let's correct the record, because the reality is even smarter. He needed the tank to hold more fuel than allowed. So the trick wasn't a bladder taking up space. The trick was a tank that could expand. But rigid metal doesn't expand, unless you build a tank within a tank, or you go back to the pressure trick. Actually, the basketball story is often conflated with his variable volume tricks. The real genius move was the pressure tank. He built a fuel tank that was rigid enough to pass inspection, but under the pressure of the fuel pumps during a race, the sides would bulge out slightly. Not much, just a fraction of an inch. But a fraction of an inch across the surface area of a large tank adds volume. When the pressure was released, the metal snapped back to its original shape. By the time the inspectors looked at it post-race, it was legal again. It was a transformer. It changed its physical properties based on whether it was racing or parked. This cat-and-mouse game started to take a toll on the officials. They became paranoid. They started creating rules specifically for Smokey. They called them the Smokey Yunick rules. If he did something on Sunday, it was written into the rulebook by Wednesday. He was single-handedly writing the NASCAR rulebook by forcing them to define things they never thought they'd have to define. He forced them to define fuel line diameter. He forced them to define body templates. He forced them to define suspension travel. And this brings us to the most controversial aspect of his career, the offset chassis. Smokey looked at an oval track. You only turn left. That's it. Turn left, go straight, turn left. So why, he asked, are we building symmetrical cars? A symmetrical car is compromised. It's built to turn right just as well as it turns left, which means it's not optimized for either.
Look, if you're running in a circle, you don't need balance, you need bias. Smokey understood that asymmetrical car is actually fighting itself on a bank oval. The track is pulling you to the right, centrifugal force, is trying to throw you into the wall, and your car is just sitting there, perfectly balanced left to right like it's waiting at a stoplight. That's wasted potential. So Smokey decided to build a car that was allergic to right turns. He shifted the entire driveline, the engine, the transmission, the drive shaft, to the left side of the chassis. Then he moved the driver's seat to the left. He shifted as much static weight as possible to the inside of the turn. In a modern Formula One car, this is standard physics management. In a 1960s stock car, it was heresy. Now, you might be thinking, wouldn't the inspectors notice that the driver is sitting against the door and the engine is off-center? Of course they would. If you just move the guts of the car, it looks wrong. So Smokey moved the body too. He mounted the body of the car offset on the frame. But then the wheels would look weird. They'd be tucked in on one side and sticking out on the other. So he modified the fenders. He widened the body on one side and narrowed it on the other. He basically sculpted the metal to hide the fact that the skeleton of the car was crab walking. From 10 feet away, it looked like a Chevrolet. From the driver's seat, it felt like a guided missile that only wanted to turn left. The car handled the corners with a level of grip that defied the tire technology of the time. It wasn't the tires, it was the weight distribution. He was using gravity as an unauthorized teammate. But if you think the offset chassis was clever, the reverse torque engine is where Smokey enters the realm of mad science. This is my absolute favorite Smokey story because it shows just how deep his understanding of physics went. Here's what most people don't realize about American V8 engines. They spin clockwise. When you sit in the driver's seat and hit the gas, the crankshaft spins clockwise. Newton's third law tells us that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So if the engine is spinning clockwise, the engine block is trying to twist counterclockwise. This torque reaction lifts the left front wheel of the car. On a drag strip, you see this all the time. The car twists as it launches. But in NASCAR, lifting the left front wheel is a disaster. You're turning left. You need that left front tire planted into the asphalt to give you grip. The standard engine rotation was literally fighting the car's ability to turn. Most mechanics tried to fix this with stiffer springs or shock absorbers. They were trying to manage the problem. Smokey decided to eliminate the problem. He asked a question that nobody else had ever asked. Why does the engine have to spin clockwise? The rulebook said the engine had to be a stock block. It didn't say which way the crankshaft had to turn. So Smokey rebuilt the engine to run backwards. He reversed the firing order. He custom ground a camshaft that worked in reverse. He even had to flip the rear end gears upside down so the car would drive forward instead of having 1 gear forward and 4 gears in reverse. The result? When the driver hit the gas, the torque reaction now twisted the engine the other way. Instead of lifting the left front tire, the engine torque pushed it down into the track. The harder he accelerated, the more grip the front end had. It was active aerodynamics before aerodynamics existed. It was mechanical downforce. The car was a monster. It stuck to the track like it was on rails. And the best part? The inspectors had no idea. They looked at the engine and it looked like a V8. They counted the spark plug wires and there were 8 of them. They didn't have X-ray vision to see the camshaft lobes. The only thing that gave it away, and this is a rumor but a great one, is that apparently the car sounded different. The harmonic whine of the gears and the exhaust pulse just sounded wrong. It sounded backwards. Eventually, NASCAR caught on, probably because Smokey couldn't help but brag about it after the fact. They added a new line to the rulebook. Engines must rotate in the direction of the manufacturer's original design.
Let's talk about materials. This is where the budget comes in. Smokey wasn't rich, but he spent money where it mattered. NASCAR rules in the 60s were obsessed with cost saving. They wanted stock parts because stock parts were cheap. They explicitly stated that suspension components, bell housings, and other structural parts had to be made of steel. Steel is strong, but steel is heavy, and in racing, weight is the enemy of everything. Smokey knew about a material that the aerospace industry was using, titanium. It's roughly as strong as steel, but weighs about 45% less. It was also exorbitantly expensive and hard to machine. But Smokey didn't care. He found a supplier and started fabricating suspension parts, axle housings, and roll bars out of titanium. Now, titanium has a distinct look. It doesn't look like steel. It has a different luster. So Smokey painted it. He took these $1,000 aerospace parts and painted them with cheap rattle-can black paint to make them look like $50 junkyard steel parts. He made the car lighter, which made it accelerate faster and stop shorter. But more importantly, he reduced the unsprung weight, the weight of the wheels and suspension components that move up and down. Lower unsprung weight means the tires stay in better contact with the road. The inspectors would walk up, tap the roll cage with a wrench, hear a clank, and assume it was steel. They didn't carry magnets. If they had, they would have realized that nothing on Smokey's car was magnetic. He was racing a spaceship disguised as a taxi. This brings us to the gray area of safety, and this is where the story gets a little complicated emotionally. Sometimes Smokey broke the rules not to go faster, but to keep his drivers alive. He famously modified the wheel hubs and axles on his cars because the stock Chevy parts were prone to breaking under the stress of racing. If an axle snaps at 150 miles per hour, the wheel comes off, the car flips, and people get hurt. Smokey built custom heavy-duty hubs that were far safer than stock. NASCAR disqualified him for it. They said, "That's not a stock part." Smokey argued, "The stock part is dangerous. I made it safer." NASCAR didn't care. The rule was the rule. This infuriated Smokey. He saw the officials not just as bureaucratic pests, but as actively negligent. To him, the rulebook was a document written by people who didn't understand engineering, enforced by people who didn't understand racing, to govern people who were risking their lives. This moral superiority fueled his cheating. He felt justified in breaking their rules because he didn't respect their competence.
This is a crucial insight into his psychology. He wasn't a criminal trying to steal a prize, he was a professional who felt insulted by amateur constraints. When he hit a nitrous oxide system in the hollow tubes of the chassis, oh yes, he did that too. He didn't feel guilty, he felt like he was correcting a cosmic error. The error being that his car wasn't as fast as it theoretically could be. The nitrous story is wild. He allegedly plumbed the gas lines through the roll cage itself. The structure of the car was a storage tank, a hidden switch, a solenoid, and suddenly the engine gets a shot of extra oxygen. But unlike the Fast and the Furious movies, Smokey used it subtly. He wouldn't hit the button on the straightaway where everyone could see the sudden burst of speed. He'd use it to get back up to speed leaving the pits, or to close a gap in traffic. He used it to normalize his race, not to create a spectacle. That's the discipline of a master cheater. You don't use your advantage to win by a mile, you use it to win by an inch. Winning by a mile draws attention. Winning by an inch draws applause. But eventually, the chaotic era had to end. By the 1970s, NASCAR was becoming a big business. Sponsors like Winston cigarettes were pouring in millions. Television was starting to pay attention. You can't have a professional sport where the outcomes are decided by who lied the best during inspection. The enforcement got stricter. They started using templates, giant metal silhouettes that fit over the car to check the body shape. If the template didn't fit, you didn't race. This was the beginning of the end for the 7/8 Chevelle. The offset chassis wouldn't fit a template. The offset chassis wouldn't fit a template. The gray areas were being filled in with black ink. But Smokey had one last major trick up his sleeve, and it wasn't a hidden tank or a reversed engine. It was an entire car design that challenged the definition of what a stock car engine actually was. He started looking at the engine not as a pump, but as a heat management system, the hot vapor engine. This wasn't a cheat for a specific race. This was an attempt to revolutionize the internal combustion engine forever. And in true Smokey fashion, it started with him telling everyone else they were doing it wrong. Look, the hot vapor engine deserves its own moment because it proves that Smokey wasn't just trying to win trophies. He was trying to solve physics. The basic problem with a gas engine is that it's inefficient. You dump fuel in, you burn some of it, and you waste most of it as heat. Smokey looked at that and said, "That's stupid." He developed a system to superheat the air-fuel mixture before it entered the cylinder. Conventional wisdom says this is wrong. Remember the cold air intake? Cold air is dense, hot air is thin. But Smokey found a way to vaporize the fuel so completely that it burned with near-perfect efficiency. He built a prototype using a humble Pontiac Fiero. It got over 50 miles per gallon and accelerated like a sports car. He took it to the big Detroit automakers. He said, "Here, I fixed your engine." They turned him down. Why? Because it would have required retooling their entire manufacturing process. It was too different. It was too Smokey. That rejection hurt him, maybe more than any disqualification. It showed him that the world wasn't always looking for the best solution. Often it was just looking for the easiest one. But before he left the racing world behind, he gave us one last masterclass in material science, the acid-dipped Camaro. This is one of those stories that sounds like a myth, but in the context of Smokey's garage, it makes perfect sense. We talked about titanium being light, but titanium is expensive. Smokey wondered, how can I make steel lighter? You can't change the atomic weight of iron, but you can use less of it. Now, you might be thinking, just use thinner sheet metal, but you can't buy 1968 Camaro fenders in extra thin. They come from the factory one way. So Smokey turned to chemistry. He famously and allegedly took the body panels of his race car and dipped them into a vat of acid. He left them there for a calculated amount of time. The acid ate away the metal evenly from every surface. When he pulled them out and rinsed them off, the fenders looked exactly the same. They held the same shape, but they were paper thin. The car was hundreds of pounds lighter than the competition. It was so fragile that you couldn't lean against it without denting it. There are stories of pit crew members being warned, do not touch the roof, do not sit on the fender, you will crush the car. It was a vehicle held together by paint and audacity. It passed inspection because inspectors measured dimensions, not density. They didn't have ultrasonic thickness gauges. They saw a Camaro. They weighed the car, and of course, Smokey had added lead weights in strategic places to meet the minimum weight requirement. But here's the trick. He put that weight exactly where he wanted it, low and to the left, while the weight he removed came from the top and the right. He didn't just lighten the car, he lowered its center of gravity dramatically. This was the peak of the gray area. But the walls were closing in. By the late 1970s and 80s, NASCAR had introduced the template. This was the death knell for the creative mechanic. The template was a giant metal frame shaped like the factory car. They would drop it onto your race car. If there was a gap, you were illegal. If it touched too hard, you were illegal. It had to fit perfectly. It turned car building from an art form into a tracing exercise. Smokey hated it. He called it cookie-cutter racing. He saw the future coming, and it was a future where the engineer didn't matter. In his eyes, if every car is identical, you aren't racing cars anymore. You're just racing drivers. And while drivers are important, Smokey believed the machine was the soul of the sport. He famously said, "You can teach a monkey to drive, but it takes a man to build a car." That's a harsh quote, and it's not entirely fair to drivers, but it reveals his worldview. He respected the creator more than the operator. He slowly stepped away from the track. He stopped building cars for NASCAR and retreated to his garage in Daytona. But he didn't disappear. He became an author. He wrote a biography titled Best Damn Garage in Town, and if you haven't read it, you need to. It is 650 pages of raw, unedited, profanity-laced truth. He names names. He draws diagrams of his cheats. He explains exactly how he screwed over the inspectors, race by race, bolt by bolt. It wasn't a confession. It was a victory lap. Here's what most people don't realize about that book. It's not just about cars. It's a manual on critical thinking. Smokey's writing reveals a mind that questioned everything. He questioned why oil filters were designed the way they were. He questioned why the government regulated fuel economy the way they did. He questioned the existence of God, the competence of politicians, and the intelligence of his neighbors. He was a difficult, prickly, brilliant man who refused to accept "because I said so" as an answer from anyone. In his later years, the industry that once called him a cheater started to call him a legend. The irony's thick. The same officials who cursed his name in 1966 were inducting him into halls of fame in the 1990s. Why? Because we love a rebel, as long as he's safely in the past. When Smokey was active, he was a threat to the integrity of the sport. Once he was retired, he became a colorful character who added to the mythology of NASCAR. It's safer to admire a pirate when he's no longer raiding your ships. But Smokey never softened. He never apologized. In interviews right up until his death in 2001, he would look the camera in the eye and say, "I didn't cheat. I just read the rule book better than they wrote it." He maintained that distinction to the grave. And technically, he was right. If the rule book says maximum fuel tank capacity 22 gallons, and you fit 22 gallons in the tank and 2 gallons in the fuel line, have you violated the rule? The rule didn't mention the line. You followed the rule exactly as written. The intent of the rule? Sure, you violated that. But motorsports is not a court of equity. It's a court of law. This legacy of interpreting rules is still alive today, but it's moved. You don't see it in NASCAR much anymore. The laser scanners are too good. You see it in Formula One. You see it in cybersecurity. You see it in high-frequency trading. Any system where there is a set of rigid rules and a high reward for performance will attract the spirit of Smokey Yunick. It's the hacker mindset. It's the idea that the system is a puzzle to be solved, not a master to be obeyed. The garage in Daytona is gone now. It was bulldozed to make way for condos or a strip mall, the ultimate indignity for a place where mechanical magic happened. But the stories survived, and they survived because they speak to something deep in our psychology. We want to believe that ingenuity can beat bureaucracy. We want to believe that one guy with a weird idea can outsmart a billion-dollar corporation. Smokey was proof that, for a little while, it was possible. There's a story about a young mechanic asking Smokey for advice in the 90s. The kid asked, "How do I become a great engine builder?" Smokey reportedly looked at him and said, "First, throw away the manual. Then, figure out how it works." That's the essence of it. The manual tells you how to maintain the status quo. If you want to exceed the status quo, you have to look where the manual is blank. One of the most surprising insights from his career is that many of his cheats eventually became standard features. The aerodynamic smoothing he did on the Chevelle, every modern car is designed that way for fuel efficiency. The cool air intake, standard on performance cars. The headers, the exhaust tuning, the suspension geometry. He was prototyping the future of the automobile, disguised as illegal racing modifications. He was dragging the automotive industry forward, kicking and screaming, one rule violation at a time. This is where we have to ask the hard question. Was Smokey Yunick a villain? In the strict binary of rules follow good, rules break bad, yes, he was a villain. He undermined the concept of a fair playing field. If every team followed the rules and one team didn't, the competition is broken. But sports aren't just about fairness, they are about entertainment, and they're about the limits of human capability. We don't watch racing to see who can follow a rule book the best, we watch to see who can go the fastest. And in that sense, Smokey was the ultimate hero. He exposed the fact that the limits were often artificial boundaries set by people with less imagination than him. There's a concept in psychology called functional fixedness. It's a cognitive bias where you see an object as working in the way it was traditionally intended. You see a fuel line as a pipe to move liquid. Smokey saw a fuel line as a storage container. You see a car body as a solid shape. Smokey saw it as a malleable sculpture. You see a rule book as a wall. Smokey saw it as a door that just needed to be picked. He didn't suffer from functional fixedness. His mind was functionally fluid, and that is a terrifying superpower to have in a regulated world. It's worth noting that the world we live in today is designed to prevent Smokey Yunicks. We live in a world of DRM, locked software ecosystems, and void if removed warranty stickers. If Smokey were alive today, he wouldn't be working on cars. You can't tune a Tesla with a wrench. You need a laptop and an encryption key. He would probably be a white hat hacker, or maybe a gray hat one, finding exploits in code rather than in carburetors. The medium has changed, but the game is exactly the same. The code is the new rulebook, and the exploit is the new fuel line.
And this is why his story resonates so heavily right now. We feel boxed in. We feel like every aspect of our lives is regulated, monitored, and optimized by someone else. Smokey represents the fantasy of breaking out of that box. He represents the idea that if you're smart enough and willing enough, you can rewrite the reality of your situation. You can drive the car without the gas tank. You can make the steel lighter than it should be. You can win against the house, even when the house holds all the cards. When he died in 2001, the racing world lost its erratic heartbeat. The cars kept going in circles, faster than ever, safer than ever, but quieter in a spiritual sense. The personality was gone. Today, drivers are media-trained athletes who thank their sponsors in perfect robotic sentences. Crew chiefs are data analysts who stare at monitors. It's professional, it's impressive. But it's not wild. You don't get the sense that anyone is hiding a basketball in the fuel tank anymore. And maybe that's better for the sport's integrity, but it's worse for the sport's soul. The sign, "Best Damn Garage in Town," wasn't just about repairing cars. It was about a standard of existence. It meant that in this specific 5,000 square feet of Florida concrete, we do not accept good enough. We do not accept it can't be done. We do not accept the manual says no. In that garage, the only law was physics, and even that was up for negotiation. Smokey proved that one person's obsession can force an entire industry to change. He forced NASCAR to become professional. He forced Detroit to think about efficiency. He forced us to question the difference between a rule and a suggestion.
So the next time you see a rule, whether it's at work, in a game, or in life, stop and look at it like Smokey would. Don't just read what it says. Read what it doesn't say. Look for the gap. Look for the silence between the words. Because in that silence, that's where the innovation lives. That's where the unfair advantage is waiting. That's where you find the 7/8 scale version of your problem that is easier to handle. Smokey Yunick didn't play the game they wanted him to play. He played the game that existed in his head, and for 50 years he dragged the rest of the world into it with him. He was a cheater, a genius, a liar, and a pioneer. And he was probably the most honest man in racing because he was the only one who admitted that winning was the only thing that mattered. It's only cheating if you get caught. He got caught sometimes, but most of the time, he just got the checkered flag. And looking back at the history of the 20th century, I think we can safely say Smokey Yunick won. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the mind of a mechanical madman, make sure you're subscribed. We've got more stories coming about the people who built the modern world by breaking every rule they could find. Leave a comment below if you think you would have banned him or hired him. I read every single one. Thanks for watching Legacy Motoring. And remember, read the fine print, then drive a truck through it.